Hello again. It is, of course, now being increasingly suggested that Britain ought to pay reparations to Caribbean nations because our country as a whole benefited from slavery. For example, taking sugar in tea in the 18th century meant buying something produced by slaves in the Caribbean. Of course, for this theory of collective guilt to work, it would be necessary for all our ancestors to be brutal and uncaring people who were happy to live on the proceeds of slavery. They would also all need to be the kind of people who could actually afford sugar and rum at that time. Of course, white people in Britain were not at all a monolithic entity, all bearing equal responsibility for the slave trade and each benefiting to the same extent. A lot of working people in the 18th century couldn't actually afford to buy sugar. It was by way of being a luxury at that time, and honey might be used instead as a sweetener. Then, too, there was a very powerful boycott of sugar which came from Caribbean plantations, a political action initiated by the Quakers in the 1780s. In the description to this video, I give a link to a bit about this. At its height, 500,000 people in this country refused to touch sugar from the Caribbean. I seriously doubt if my own ancestors at that time were able to indulge in such a thing. As far back as I've been able to trace my family, they seem to have been paupers and low-grade manual workers. One was even described in the census as a pauper lunatic. If compensation is to be offered for past exploitation, I would be very irritated if I was to fund any such reparation to anybody via my taxes. You see, neither I nor any of my ancestors owned slaves or benefited in any way whatsoever from slavery, the slave trade, or anything at all to do with it. I have paid my taxes for years on what I earn, and I would consider it monstrous if the money that I have given should be sent across the Atlantic to pay for the supposed sins of people who died centuries ago and to whom I am not related. There comes a time, and I certainly think that time has arrived by now, when we have to forget the past and simply deal with the world as we find it. Countries in the Caribbean like Haiti and Jamaica have brilliant climates for growing crops and are also rich in natural resources such as gold and bauxite ore, from which aluminium is made. I'm aware that those countries are fading and that Haiti is falling apart. Large parts of Jamaica are no-go areas controlled by vicious gangsters. But that's not my fault, and nor is it the fault of my distant forebears either. Some countries which were once British colonies, Singapore, say, or Israel and India, are thriving. Others, primarily in Africa and the Caribbean, are not. They are, some of them, approaching the status of failed states, which is a tragedy for those living there. I can quite see that they feel that a massive injection of cash might stave off their collapse for a few years, but I really don't see why that should be my responsibility. I pay taxes for the benefit of this country, not so that the money can be chucked at the West Indies in some kind of rescue mission. It is seriously being proposed these days that the whole industrial revolution in Britain was actually founded upon slavery, and that for this reason the prosperity of modern Britain is a direct consequence of the slave trade. That being so, it would be only just for us to share our riches with the descendants of slaves now living in Jamaica. This weird idea has only arisen in the last few years and owes a good deal to the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th century began in Britain. It was based on steam and water power, and fuelled by the vast deposits of coal and iron in this country. The working conditions for those in mines at that time extracting these minerals from the ground were absolutely appalling, as were the conditions in the factories. They were often at least as bad as those on plantations in the West Indies. This, rather than the islands of the Caribbean which produced luxury goods like sugar and rum, was the basis for Britain's wealth today. It was built on the exploitation of British workers rather than black slaves. These were my ancestors, and they were cruelly exploited. It was their work and suffering which made Britain prosperous, not the slave trade. If anybody deserves compensation, I think that I and other people whose families were ordinary workers deserve the first share of any money going. It was my ancestors who were mistreated to build fortunes, and without those countless people in the mines and factories of Britain in the 18th and 19th century, this country would not have become so rich. If there is compensation going, then I should be in line for it.